Cuba, a rich and prosperous country in the first half of the 20th century. It went from this to this, from being a possible world power to being labeled the poorest country in Latin America. From being a country everyone wanted to move to, it became the country everyone wants to escape from. Before 1959, Cuba was one of the most developed countries in Latin America and had socioeconomic indicators superior to those of many regions in the central United States or southern Europe. At that time, great things were achieved in Cuba. In 1889, the first public lighting system in all of Iberoamerica was installed in Cuba. The first worldwide demonstration of an industry powered by electricity took place in Havana in 1877. In 1900, before any other country in Latin America, the first automobile arrived in Havana. In 1937, Cuba decreed for the first time in Iberoamerica the 8-hour workday and the minimum wage. The first building in the world, constructed with reinforced concrete, was the Foxa of Havana, built in 1952. In 1958, Cuba was the second country in the world to broadcast color television. Despite its small size and having only 6.5 million inhabitants in 1958, Cuba ranked 29th among the largest economies in the world, had a promising future. Its economy was growing rapidly thanks to developing industries like the sugar industry, where it became the world's leading exporter. Today, all this may have disappeared. It may be in last place in economic development. There may be a lack of public lighting in the 21st century, when it was the first country in Latin America to have it, or that sugar is no longer produced. But what happened for this to occur? In 1952, Fulgencio Batista took power and established a military regime that changed the democratic course of the island. Thus, in the year 1958, Cuba suffered an arms embargo by the United States government, which, among other things, helped the rebels led by Fidel Castro to come to power in 1959. This is a very summarized story from before 59, but what interests us today is from here onwards. What would have happened if Cuba had continued on the democratic path that Batista twisted? Can you imagine the development Cuba would have today? With the need to restore democratic order in the country, the Cuban people saw in the revolutionary movement led by Fidel a way to restore the democracy he claimed to pursue. Multiple times he asserted that he was neither Marxist nor communist, and that he only sought democracy and social justice.
There is not communism or Marxism.
Was it so? Let's see. Upon coming to power, his plans became evident. Increase in wages, reduction in rents, lowering of electricity rates, and expropriation of large tracts of land from foreign companies, which were turned into state property. The latter meant that all investments from foreign companies, mostly American, would come under Cuban government control. This expropriation deteriorated relations with the American government, compounded by the commercial association between Cuba and the Soviet Union during the Cold War era, which led to the establishment of an economic embargo against the island that prohibited trading with Cuba any American products. Until today, the Cuban government blames this economic embargo for its miserable situation. Is this real? From this embargo and the ties formed in 1960, the island began to establish a relationship of economic and political dependence with the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro's regime had nationalized the entire economy and did not hide that it was socialist. The state set prices and determined what was produced and what was not, which distorted the economy. The companies did not have the necessary means to reach the assigned production, and newly built factories closed due to a lack of components. On the other hand, everyone was guaranteed a job, but this meant that some companies had more staff than necessary, or that in others, productivity was very low. These populist measures went against the basic laws of the economy and the market, since behind every product or industry, there is added value, competition, and demand that only the producer knows and balances the free market. To this, we must add the exodus of skilled professionals who began to emigrate from the island to the United States and other places, which worsened this problem as managerial positions were chosen based on loyalty to the socialist revolution and not on merit, experience, or knowledge. All of this caused an economic disaster that they still suffer from to this day. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the island was left without a developed industry, without fuels, without anything. Those were dark times for the island. After the era when the Soviet Union provided them with everything, thanks to which they managed to survive. At that moment, the island fell into a crisis that continues to this day and is worsening. To give you an idea, when the socialist bloc dissolved in 1991, Cuba's gross domestic product fell by almost 40%. The following years were a very difficult period for the Cuban people. A period of economic decline known as the Special Period. During this time, it was common for ordinary Cubans not to find food and to spend days without electricity, which caused tens of thousands of people to flee the island. The Cuban economy recovered years later. When economic activities and foreign investment were timidly liberalized, the dollar was legalized, and self-employment was authorized for about 150 occupations. This led to the emergence of new hotels, restaurants, nightclubs, and small businesses in Havana. The Cuban economy had a slight recovery thanks to these policies, but it was not enough. What allowed the socialist regime to survive was its alliance with Venezuela when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998. Just as it had happened with the Soviet Union, Venezuela became Cuba's most important commercial and diplomatic ally. It supplied oil at a low price and other aid that between 2002 and 2011 amounted to more than $80 billion. Cuba went from depending on Soviet Union subsidies to depending on Venezuelan subsidies. When the situation in Venezuela began to deteriorate after the death of Hugo Chavez, so did that of the island. This, the lack of freedom and changes in the country's economic policy, the multiple deaths, and the COVID-19 crisis made its economy amount to nothing. Currently, it is a country with a large part of its population in a situation of, in 2023, the company Data World revealed that Cuba was the poorest country in Latin America, ahead of Venezuela and Honduras. In 2022, the island had already been labeled as the country with the most miserable economy in the world, according to the annual Hanke Misery Index, and by 2024, the situation of extreme poverty in Cuba had grown to 89%, the worst figure in its history. The country is in its worst economic crisis, and some even argue that it is worse than that suffered in the 90s. A weary people who had always lived with only the basic necessities met have seen their situation worsen since the pandemic period of 2020. The fall in wages, which were never enough to live on, poor nutrition, the deterioration of public services, one of the highest inflations in the world, power outages for consecutive days due to breakdowns and lack of fuels, on which 99% of the country's electricity generation depends, lack of medical supplies, and an increasingly larger class differentiation. The drop in tourists due to the pandemic increased the island's economic difficulties, as we can see in the figures. In 2022, the Dominican Republic surpassed the arrival of tourists to Cuba by 5.25 times, and only Quintana Roo in Mexico surpassed it by 14.68 times. The figure that currently reflects all this is the protests, such as the one that occurred on July 11, 2021, where many Cubans took to the streets to protest, resulting in thousands of political prisoners due to the lack of democracy and freedom of expression on the island. The largest migratory exodus in its history, in 2022. Far from the tens of thousands of people who risked crossing the sea in precarious rafts in search of a better life in the 1990s. Between 2022 and 2023, the Cuban population on the island decreased by 20%, which is almost 2.5 million fewer people than the 11.1 million in 2021. At least 533,000 Cubans arrived in the United States alone in 2022 and 2023, making the current migration crisis much greater than the 300,000 who fled in the early years of the revolution, starting in 1959. This surpasses the 130,000 of the Mariel Exodus in 1980 and the 35,000 of the Rafter Exodus in 1994. The migratory exodus also led to the fall of remittances, one of the sources of foreign currency income left for the island, which has decreased by 3.3% in this 2023, being the only country in Latin America where this happened. The Cuban economy has completely stagnated, and the data is reflected in its gross domestic product, which still shows no signs of wanting to recover from the pandemic period. So, Do you think the decision that changed the course of the island was to nationalize all the companies in the country, including the American companies? This decision had two serious consequences. First, it destroyed the motivation and aspirations of workers and entrepreneurs by eliminating the free market and, with it, the capacity for growth and economic evolution. Second, it became an enemy of its best trading partner by power and proximity, the United States, and came to depend heavily on what happened with the Soviet Union. We would not be lying if we said that Cuba would be better off without the embargo, but blaming the embargo and not the socialist policies established in 1960, which continue to this day, for the current misery of the island is a big mistake. The problem is that the Cuban government does not pay its external debts. In total, it accumulates 30 billion in external debt, to which can be added the debt they have with Argentina since 1983, a debt of more than 50 years that could amount to $4 billion. This figure is even higher for China, which has already established many commercial ties with the island and has recommended that it change its centrally planned economic system. And what about the debt they have with Russia, which dates back to the Soviet era and amounted to about 35 million, of which Vladimir Putin has decided to forgive 90%. This large debt and such a backward productive system that it cannot produce the goods the international market needs, and if they produce them, they could not compete with international companies. Even so, the embargo is the excuse the Cuban government has been using for decades to hide the failures of its economic policy. The same policy that ruined Venezuela, the country with the largest oil reserves in the world, and that today finds itself in a very similar situation to the island. In 2023, the gross domestic product fell by 2%, so its economy still has not recovered from the last crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, while the world has already done so. Cuba, for its part, is sinking. All economic data is alarming. Since 1980, the country's industrial production has fallen by 60%, a decline that continues to increase and has spread to all economic sectors. In a country that was the world's largest exporter of sugar, production has fallen from 8 million tons in 1985 to just 350,000 tons in 2023, which is not even enough for domestic consumption, having to import it. The Cuban economy has been mismanaged this badly. This has happened not only with sugar, but also with almost any product the country has produced. Inflation hit the island since the implementation of the so-called monetary ordering task, an ambitious economic and monetary reform that aimed to increase wages and pensions, but ended up causing the opposite effect. In practice, it only caused inflation to skyrocket and the purchasing power of Cubans to decrease to the point where the minimum wage is just $8, with which they might only be able to buy a carton of eggs to eat one each day.